All right, so we'll say good morning. Let us begin. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Max and Brenda Lapkovsky, in honor of Yitzchak Meir's upcoming bar mitzvah. Dr. Riva Mitzner, in commemoration of the first yarzheit of her father, Dr. Schneck, Aryeh Ben Chaim, Zichron Livracha. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Mark and Sarah Meisler, for the yarzheit of Mark's grandmother, Ann Altman, Chana Devora Bas Yehuda, and Bill and Rezi Eskin, Lezech Nishmas, Bill's father Mordechai Ben David, and Rezi's mother Tzivia Bas Moshe Aaron. And our Daf Yomi sponsors, Dr. and Mrs. Warshawski, in memory of Camille Warshawski, Kayla Bas Hachaver Moshe Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, and their families a nechama. And also with that, let us begin. So a very exciting daf ahead of us today, a lot to do today. Today's daf is daf ches. We are picking up on daf zayin amud beis. We actually have a lot to do on zayin amud beis as well. So we actually left off kind of by Abaye, which is pretty much like in the middle of zayin amud beis, but it'll move quickly. Amir Tzashem. Amr Abaye. If you see Tosas Sichech, if you go across from Tosas Sichech in the Gemara about 4 lines up from that, so the Gemara says Amr Abaye. So Amr Abaye, Rabbi Yoshia, Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer, V'achirim, Kulam Svir Lahu, Succah Diras Arai Ba'inan. So both say, interestingly enough, the Gemara quotes over here as follows. The Gemara says, Abaye says, all of these particular opinions require that sukkah be a diras arai. Now, diras keva, diras keva. Now, I remember again, at first glance, this statement seems incredibly strange because the entire essence of sukkah is a diras arai. Say midiras keva, leave your permanent dwelling and enter into your diras arai, enter into your impermanent dwelling. And what Abaye is pointing out over here is as follows. And I will say this is a little bit of the strange dialectic in sukkah. Sukkah on one hand is diras arai, it's an impermanent dwelling. But what Abaye is saying is it also has to be, or these opinions hold, it also has to be a bias. It has to be, right? Sukkah becomes your home for 7 days. Well, in order for the sukkah to become your home for 7 days, at the end of the day, there has to be some degree of permanence associated with it. So all of these opinions hold that halacha l'maisa, the sukkah must have some degree of permanence. So let's go through them. The Gemara says as follows. Rebbe, where do we see the opinion of Rebbe? Disanya, Rebbe Omer, kol sukkah she'in ba arba amos al arba amos psula. Rebbe holds any sukkah that doesn't have daled by daled. It's got to be daled amos by daled amos. So we'll say, so remember again, why daled amos by daled amos? Remember again, go back for a moment to our daf a few days ago. We saw the minimum dimensions of a home, of a bayis, are daled by daled, right? For example, again, if you have a home that is less than daled by daled, remember again, it's not chayiv in mezuzah. So you see that the minimum dimensions of a bayis, of a home, are daled by daled. Rabbi Yoshia Hadam, Rabbi Yoshia Bosei, is what we said above. Rabbi Yoshia said that not only does the schach have to provide shade, but the walls have to provide shade as well. Rabbi Yehuda, what does Rabbi Yehuda say? This nan, sukkah shigavola mal mechaf amma psula. Going back to our first Mishnah, the Rabbanan said that a sukkah that's taller than 20 amos is puzzle. Now, we'll say, remember, for a variety of different reasons, Rabbi Yehuda says that it's kosher. The Gemara's understanding Rabbi Yehuda's willingness to say that it's kosher is because Rabbi Yehuda holds that the sukkah needs to be a diras keva. One of the opinions, I will say, that the reason that a sukkah l'mala me'esrim amma is going to be puzzle is why? Because that's called a diras keva. Rabbi Yehuda says, no problem, a sukkah can be a diras keva, a permanent dwelling. Rabbi Shimon desanyek beis kil chasan v'gima afilu tefach. Rabbi Shimon Omer gimel kil chasan v'dalad afilu tefach. What's Rabbi Shimon in yesterday's daf? Rabbi Shimon says a sukkah needs 4 walls. 4 walls. 3 regular walls, and the 4th wall only has to be a tefach. The fact that he requires a 4th wall is why the Gemara understands why, in order to go ahead and be a diras keva. Rabbi Gamliel, what did Rabbi Gamliel say? Disanya, ha'oses sukkasa b'rosh ha'agala o b'rosh ha'sfina. What if one goes in and makes their sukkah on a wagon? On a wagon. Right? We'll say this was the first Chabad sukkah, right? Right? The mobile sukkah. Before they had pickup trucks, right? So you put it on the back of a wagon, or Barosh Hasina, or on a boat. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Rabbi Gamliel posts. Rabbi Gamliel says it's possible. We'll discuss why. Rabbi Akiva machshir, and ultimately again, Rabbi Akiva says it's kosher. The Gemara is assuming right now that the reason Rabbi Gamliel says that it's possible is because that's not called diras keva. That's not called a permanent dwelling. Beis Shammai, what did Beis Shammai say? Disnan misha hayarosha v'ruba v'sukkah v'shulchan v'socha bayis. Beis Shammai said, if someone is sitting in their sukkah and their head and the majority of the body is in their sukkah, but their shulchan, their table, is inside of the home, Beis Shammai poslin. Beis Shammai says ultimately again it's possible. Ubeis Silamati machshirin. Because again, Beis Shammai will say you need more of a diras keva. Rabbi Eliezer say this nan ha'oses sukaso kamin srif. But it's an interesting case. If you make your sukkah, srif literally is like a tent or a hut. But if you could imagine, this is a situation. Imagine you're making a tent-like sukkah, but ultimately, again, remember in a tent, the roof and the sides are the same thing. So in this case over here, imagine you made your roof sides at a schach. So you have effectively no walls. All you have is schach. So samcha lekosel, or we'll say, imagine you took your schach and you leaned it against the wall. So let's say the wall is your wall, but the schach is slanted against it. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Eliezer says that it's possible. Lefi she'ein lagag, because it doesn't have a roof. Because Rabbi say because Rabbi Eliezer demands that a sukkah be a home, a diras keva, and a diras keva has walls and a roof. The Chachamim say that it's kosher. Achirim, what do the Achirim say? Disanya Achirim omrim sukkah ha'asuya kishovach. If a sukkah is made like a shovach, I will say now shovach literally means a dovecote, right? Rashi says over here, the point to remember is agula, it's round. If you make a round sukkah, im yesh be'kefa, I'm sorry, kishav psula, lefisha in lazavios. Achirim say, if you make a round sukkah, it's going to be possible. Why? Because it doesn't have corners. We'll say, what's wrong with not having corners? Ultimately, again, because again, the Achirim will say, that does not resemble a diras keva, right? That does not resemble, ultimately, again, that does not resemble a more permanent structure. So the common denominator amongst all of these opinions that are quoted is that, I want to be clear, everyone agrees that the essence of a sukkah is a diras arai, is a temporary, impermanent dwelling. That's what everyone agrees. But at the end of the day, what these particular opinions hold is that there must be diras arai, an impermanent dwelling. What they all agree, however, is there must be some element of keva. There must be some element of permanence, because remember, the whole dwelling becomes my permanent dwelling for 7 days. So in order to reflect that, even the diras arai has to have some element of keva. Good, that's the opinion. I will say, now it happens to be, we're gonna see this, because we'll see all of these cases in greater depth. We accept this premise to a certain degree, right? So that's why, for example, there are certain parts of the sukkah, we'll discuss about, a wall that could stand up to a ruach mitzuya, right? A wall that could stand up to just a regular wind, or a mechitza she'en agedim bokimbo, or you can't have breaches in a wall so big that an animal could run through it. We will have these kind of ideas. So sukkah represents this interesting dialectic that on one hand it's clearly diras arai, temporary dwelling, but yet in order to make it your home, it has to have certain keva qualities. What type of keva qualities? How many keva qualities? That's going to be subject to machlokes. So we'll say, now that the Gemara brought up this case, of the sukkah hasuya kishovach, which was the circular sukkah, the Gemara is going to focus for a bit on this. This is going to be our Amud Aleph. We're going to go through this sugya relatively quickly, because we're going to see at the end of the day, this is the Gemara is going to talk about a number of mathematical equations, but the conclusion of the Gemara, not to give it away, is that the equations, right, or the formulas don't really seem to add up. That's going to be the conclusion. So because it's the advantage of preparing the shir ahead of time. Right? So because they don't fully add up, we'll kind of just run through it a little bit, get a flavor for it. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Sukkah asui kivshan. What if you have a sukkah that's made like a kivshan? I'm saying a kivshan literally means a furnace. Now, if you look at Rashi says agula de lesle ka'achirim. Ultimately, again, it's a circle. It's a circle sukkah. And Rashi just points out this clearly does not reflect the view of the achirim, because the achirim just said before that what? That a sukkah that's done that doesn't have corners is possible. Okay, assuming we don't accept that opinion, you make a circular sukkah. So what says now the shaila is, how big does a circular sukkah have to be? So Rabbi Yochanan says, sukkah asui kivshan, im yishpeh keifa kedei leishev b'achav daled b'nei adam kshera. If at the end of the day it's large enough that you could seat 24 people in the circumference of the sukkah, then the sukkah is kosher. Ve'im lav, and if not, psula. So that's the shear for a circular sukkah, seating 24 people in the circumference of the sukkah. So Kiman, I will say now, whose opinion does that reflect? Kirebi. It must be Rebbe, because what did Rebbe hold? Da Amar kol sukkah she'in ba'arba amos l'arba amos psula. Because Rebbe held that a sukkah has to be dalet amos by dalet amos. Let's analyze this. Michdi, I will say, we assume that 3 tefachim in circumference represents 1 tefach in diameter. But if that's the case, b'treis sagi, then you don't need a sukkah that seats 24 people. All you need is a sukkah that seats 12 people. To which the Gemara says, top of chesam medalif, hani mili bi'igula. That's true in a circle. Aval biribua, but I will say when you're talking about a square, bayitfei, you're going to require more space. You're going to see, because obviously, what does the square have over the circle? The corners. We're going to discuss this. Michti, kamer meruba yoser ala igol. How much larger is the circle? How much larger is the square than the circle? Revia, 1/4. We assume that a square will always be 1/4 larger than the circle. We're going to discuss, Rabbi say, this is all going to have to do with how you're drawing everything, right? Are you drawing the circle in the square, or are you drawing ultimately again the square in the circle? Okay, but we'll see this. So how much larger generally do we assume the square is than the circle? So Revia, ultimately again 1/4 larger. Well, again, once again, b'shisar sagi, then Abba say still the requisite shear should be 16 amos. Hanimili bi'igul dinafik migoribu, as we just mentioned before. This is true when what? When ultimately you're drawing the circle inside of the square. So we'll say you have 2 pictures over here in the right. Do you have pictures in the Gemara also? Good. So hanimili bi'igul dinafik migoribu. That's true when you're drawing the circle inside of the square. Aval ribua dinafik migoi gula, but I will say ultimately if you're drawing the square within the circle, bayitfei, then of course also you're going to need even a greater circumference or a greater diameter in order to accommodate that. To which the Gemara says, Mishum Marsha de Karnasa, because obviously if you're drawing the circle, it's the square inside of the circle, you have the corners as well. So let's analyze. Michti, kol amsa biribua, amsa utre chumsha, ba'alach suna. So let's analyze this. I will say any amma of circumference ultimately again is going to be an amma and 2/5 in the alachson, in the diameter. If that's the case, then again I will say the shear for the circular sukkah b'shivsar nechichumsha sagya. Ultimately again it should be 17 amas minus a bit or minus a fifth. So the Gemara says, Lo duck. That's okay. You know, when he said the shear of 16 amas before, he just wasn't being exact. The shear is really 17 amas minus a bit, and he just wasn't being so exact. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Imar da'amina lo duck porta. When we see that someone is not particular with the shear, that's fine if they're a little bit off. The Gemara says, tuva mi aminon. But if the disparity ultimately again is too great, do we say lo duck? To which the Gemara says, Amrali Markashisha Braid Rav Chista, Ravashi, Misavris Gavra Ba'amsa Yosef. Do you as well say? Now remember, this whole discussion was premised on the idea that when a person sits, they occupy an am of space. Is that true? It's not really true. Rather, Rabbi say the way to look at it is as follows: Tlasa Gavri Betarti Amsa Yosef. Rabbi say really the shear is 3 people occupy 2 amas of space. So it's not really 1 person per amma. It's 3 people occupy 2 amas of space. So kama havilahu. Therefore, we'll say what's going to be the size of the circular sukkah. Shissar, ultimately again 16 amas. Ana shivsar nechi chumsha ba'inan. But yet again, we mentioned before 17 minus a fifth. And we'll say that's close enough. 16 to 17 minus a fifth. You could say lo dak. You can say the Tana just wasn't very particular with his shear. Seimer damina lo dak l'chumra. Ultimately, again, I will say, when do we say lo dak? When do we say that halacha l'maisa, a Tana is not careful with his measurements or not exact with his measurements? L'chumra. We'll say that's only if he overestimates. L'kula mi'aminon. But do we ever say that again, lo dak, when it results ultimately in a kula? Let's go back to our original premise. A person occupies an am of space. Rabbi Yochanan, makom gavri lo chashiv. Rabbi Yochanan will say is not measuring the sukkah by the amount of space that a person takes up. So kamahav, well, says, therefore let's analyze this. How much are we talking about? What's the size? So tamni sari. Ultimately, again, it should be 18 amas. I think 1 second. You just said before. You just said before that 17 amas minus a fifth is also enough. To which the Gemara says, Hainu lo dak. That's what it means when we say that the Tana was not exact with his measurement. Uluchumra lo dak. So I'll say the true measurement is going to be a sukkah with an 18 amma circumference. Really, 17 minus the fifth is enough. The Tana was not exact, and that's okay. You could say that now. Why? Because we'll say here the inexactitude of the Tana's shear results in a chumrah, because you're saying you need more, which is fine. So Rabbanim de Kesari Amri, the rabbis of Kesaria, others say it was the Dayanim of Kesaria Amri, Igula dinafik migo ribua riva. So I will say which is that the circumference is 1/4 less than the perimeter of a square. Circumference is 1/4 less than the perimeter of a square. On the flip side, Amud Beis, ribua dinafik migo igula palga. The perimeter of a square is 1/2 smaller than the circumference of a circle. To which the Gemara says those shiurim don't work. Velohi the kachazinon the lo havi kulihai. And I will say the Gemara says we see that it's not true. The measurements do not add up. Okay, so we'll say. So bottom line, what's the takeaway? What's the takeaway from the sukkah? So we'll say. So first of all, you should know halacha lamaisa. We paskin that a circular sukkah is kosher. A circular sukkah is kosher. In other words, but remember again, to make this very simple, you could build a circular sukkah, but lamaisa at the end of the day, the circular sukkah must conform to the minimum dimensions of sukkah. What's the minimum dimensions of sukkah? 7 by 7, 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim, rosho, rubo, v'shulchano. So as long as at the end, so essentially, now again, that is true, that is a square measurement. So as long as that square measurement is fit into a circular sukkah, Shulchan Aruch paskins halacha l'maisa, that's kosher. So the shear doesn't change. The shear is the shear. Zayin al zayin. Whatever shape you want to make it in, you can make it in. But I will say, but at the end of the day, we paskin against the Achirim, because the Achirim said in previous Gemara that you cannot make a circular sukkah. We paskin that halacha l'maisa, you can make a circular sukkah as long as it conforms to the shiurim of zayin al zayin. Incredible. But let's go weiter. Rabbi Levi, Mishra Meir. But very fascinating sugya ahead of us now. So Rabbi Levi said, name Rabbi Meir. Shtei sugos shel yotzrim. So we'll say you have two craftsmen sukkahs. Now, what's the case over here? Take a look at Rashi. Shtei sugos shel yotzrim. Rashi says, Kach haya derech shel yotzrei klei cheretz b'yameihem. So we're talking about craftsmen who used to fashion earthenware utensils. So this is what they used to have. Osen lahen shtei sugos zu lifnei mizu. So an earthenware craftsman used to go ahead and have two huts, two sukkos, one inside of the other. Now, what it means when it says one inside of the other, it really means one in front of the other. So you'd have Sukkah A, and then in front of Sukkah A, you'd have Sukkah B behind it. Now watch this. So bepnimis hudar umatznia kidei rosav. So we'll say in the inner sukkah, that would be his domicile sukkah. That would be the craftsman would live there. He would live there. He would keep his stuff there. Hudar matznia kidei rosav ubechitzona hu osa melachto umose kidei rosav limkar. So we'll say the outer sukkah, we'll call it the sukkah. That was his shop. He would produce his wares, and that is where he would also go ahead and sell his wares. So production and sale would take place in the outer hut, and he would live in the inner hut. Okay, so we'll say, let's go back to the Gemara. So I'm going to be Mishra Meir. Shtei sukkos shel yotzrim. So you have a double sukkah of craftsmen. Zu lifnim mizu. One inside, really one in front of the other. So watch this. Hapenimis eno sukkah. The inner sukkah, which again I'll call it the back sukkah. The back sukkah cannot be used as a sukkah. Now both say. Now again, I want to point out. Remember, this is a hut, which means it had walls and what? And it also went ahead and had a thatched roof. So it had schach. So pretty much everything you need in order to be a kosher sukkah was in fact there. But nevertheless, the back sukkah, which is his domicile sukkah, his domicile hut, cannot be used to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah. Okay, we'll discuss why. Furthermore, v'chayeves b'mezuzah, and it's chayev in mezuzah, right? So the craftsman has to put a mezuzah on that back hut. But say, take a look at Rashi. Penimis ein sukkah im balei shebesucha b'chag l'shem sukkah. If he wants to use that back hut, his domicile hut, for the mitzvah of sukkah, it's not going to work. Va'af agav delo ba'inon sukkah l'shem chag. The hakibeis hilo kamelon the machshiri sukkah yisharim masnisin. Both say this is actually going to be tomorrow's sukkah. Tomorrow's sugya. Sorry, tomorrow's sugya. This is actually tomorrow's topic. This is actually, you can see, it's the Mishnah on Tesam Dal, Sukkah Yeshana, about the fact that you could actually use a sukkah that wasn't built for the purpose of sukkah, for the mitzvah of sukkah. Right? It was a very interesting idea. So again, the Gemara is getting ahead of itself a little bit. So if I don't need a sukkah that's made l'shem sukkah, then why can't the craftsman use his back huts for the mitzvah of sukkah? Hacha eno sukkah, Rashi says, de lo minkar a milsa de l'shem sukkahu. Because hudarbo, the ha kol yemo sashana dayer hasam v'rov tashishu v'sudas sashana sasham. So the Gemara says like this. Do you know why the craftsman can't use the back sukkah? You know why I can't use the back sukkah, his domicile sukkah? Because it's not going to be apparent that he's fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah. So I'll say what we're going to see is, as much as you don't necessarily need a sukkah that's made for the purpose of the mitzvah of sukkah, your dwelling in the sukkah must be clearly representative of the fact that you're doing this for the purpose of a mitzvah. If it's not clear that you're living there for the purpose of a mitzvah, that's not the mitzvah of sukkah. So therefore, again, the craftsman can't use the back hut for the mitzvah of sukkah. Why not? He lives there the whole year. So because he lives there the whole year, it's not going to be apparent that he's using that for the mitzvah of sukkah. Furthermore, again, it's chayeves b'mezuzah. Rashi says, the chayeves b'mezuzah the olam b'shum dechol dira sabah. It's chayev b'mezuzah. Why? Because that's his home. Because that's where he lives. Vachitzona, back to the Gemara. Vachitzona, but we'll say if he wants to use the outer sukkah, the front sukkah, for the mitzvah of sukkah on the Yom Tov of Sukkis, that works. So we'll say, why does that work? What does he normally use the first sukkah for? The outer sukkah? Right? That's his shop. Oh, so you want to make that your domicile for 7 days. Oh, then that is apparent that is the mitzvah of sukkah, and that ultimately again will work. Upetura mina mezuzah. And at the end of the day, the outer sukkah, right, we'll call it the front sukkah, the shop sukkah, that's going to be pater from mezuzah. We'll say, why is that pater from mezuzah? Because that's not a domicile. Remember again, the biblical obligation for mezuzah is only upon a domicile. So that's not his domicile. He doesn't live there. So because of that halacha l'mais, he doesn't have to put a mezuzah there. The Gemara says va'amai. But why doesn't the outer sukkah, the front sukkah, require a mezuzah as well? Tehavi chitzona kebeis shara pnimis. Ultimately, again, the outer sukkah should be like an entranceway to the inner sukkah, and the inner sukkah is his domicile. V'tischayi b'mezuzah mishum. I'm sorry. V'amai tehavi chitzona kebeis. I'm sorry. V'amai tehavi chitzona kebeis shara pnimis v'tischayi b'mezuzah. Both say there's a halacha that if a particular space serves as an entryway to a domicile, you have to put the mezuzah on the entryway. So we all agree that the inner sukkah requires a mezuzah. Why? Because he lives there. So why don't we look at the outer sukkah as the entranceway to the inner sukkah, and halacha l'maisa make it chayv mezuzah based on that? To which the Gemara says mishum delo kavia, because at the end of the day, it's not kavua, it's not established. Also, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. First, why mishum delo kavia? Lo lezu velo lezu davar kavua. Because we'll say at the end of the day, these are huts. And because they're huts, they're not totally kavua, they're not totally established. and because you're not established, that outer hut could be moved at any time, and therefore halacha l'maaseh cannot be considered like a base shar, like an entranceway to the inner hut. So we'll say so good. So Rabbi Levi introducing us to this very interesting idea, which is in the case of the craftsman, right? Double hut setup, outer hut, workshop, inner hut, domicile. The inner hut is chay b'mezuzah, right? Cannot be used as sukkah, because we'll say what we begin to see from here. So you begin to see, by the way, we're picking up like a number of nuanced details by sukkah. In the previous sugya, we learned that as much as sukkah is a diras arai, there have to be certain elements of keva associated with it. Now we're beginning to see that as much as you don't need a sukkah, you don't need to build a sukkah l'shem sukkah. That'll be tomorrow's sugya. But your dwelling in the sukkah must be clear, must clearly represent that you're doing this for the sake of the mitzvah of sukkah. Therefore, again, the craftsman cannot fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah by living in the hut he lives in all year, even though what? It's a bona fide sukkah. Right? It's interesting. So let's go weiter. Ten Rabbanan. Ganbach. So also listen to this. Ganbach is in Umanic. What does that stand for? Sukkahs goyim, sukkahs noshim, sukkahs behema, sukkahs kusim, sukkah mikamakom kshera. I will say ganbach. All of these type of sukkahs are kosher for use on Yom Tov. Right? Sukkahs goyim. Was Sukkahs Goyim? That's the hut of a non-Jew. Rashi says Sukkahs Goyim Shasuya Ladar Babi Mosachama. So let's say a non-Jewish person has a summer hut, right? He summers in a hut. So what happens? Now again, it's a bona fide sukkah, right? It meets all the criteria. I could use that for sukkahs. I could use that to fulfill my mitzvah of sukkah. Now, I'll say again, we'll discuss what you have to do with this. There are still certain. The Gemara makes it sound like you don't have to do anything with it. You do, but what we're going to see is, essentially, you don't need a hut that's built l'shem sukkah in order to fulfill your mitzvah. As I will say, right, it doesn't have to have kiddush printed on the wall in order for it to go ahead and be a kosher sukkah, right? Any hut will do as long as it satisfies certain criteria. So that's sukkahs goyim. Sukkahs nashim, what's the case of the hut of women? So again, the Gemara explains over here, when actually doesn't say it, but Sukkahs Nashim was a hut that they used to use for weaving. Okay, a weaving hut. Sukkahs Behema. So Sukkahs Behema, we'll say, is a sukkah, not that's made for animals, but rather, again, a sukkah that was made for shepherds when they would go ahead and watch the animals. Or the truth is, we'll see, it's actually machlokes. Some say Sukkahs Behema actually means a hut made for an animal. Sukkahs Kusim, which of us, again, remember, we always come back to the Kusim, right? We're not sure about their identity. They were transplanted to Eretz Yisrael by Shalmaneser, the king of Ashur. They converted. There was an outbreak of lions. Are they Jewish? Are they not Jewish? Legitimate conversion, not. Okay, if they made huts, you could use their huts. And sukkah, mikal makam. And any type of sukkah. Now, we'll discuss exactly what that means. But I will say the common denominator is kshera. All of these are kosher. O bilvad, Shetei misucheches kilchas. So I will say, of course, the caveat is the schach has to be appropriate. In other words, what the Gemara is saying is, you could use any hut you want, but the hut must conform to the particular halachic criteria. Good. My kilchasa, I will say, what does that mean, by the way, that the schach is kilchasa is appropriate? Amrav Chisda, v'hu sha'asa l'tzel. I will say, this is very interesting, that it has to be the kind of hut that was constructed for the purpose of shade. In other words, I don't need a sukkah to be made for the sake of the mitzvah. But in order for the sukkah to be effective, it has to be the type of structure whose primary purpose is for shade. That's the reason it was made, to provide shade. It could have been made to provide shade for goyim, for kusim, for nashim to weave. That's fine. But as long as it was a structure that was made for shade, it could be transformed for use for sukkahs as well, which is very interesting. Sukkah. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, my kilchasa, my asal hashmoinon, the ilu shetei tzilas imro mechamasa, or bedavar shakash lasachik bo pshita. So we'll say, the reason why the Gemara was intrigued by that lashon of misucheches kilchasa, as long as it's properly schacht, what is that saying? That the schach has to provide more shade than sun? Or that, in other words, that's obvious. What the Gemara means when it says shetei misucheches kilchasa means at the end of the day to tell us what? Rashi says, we could just say it outside, that it has to be a structure made for shade. At the end of the day, Sukkah Kriya al Shem Schach. It's called the Sukkah because of the Schach. And the entire purpose of the Schach is to do what? Is to provide shade. So what the Gemara is saying is, if you find another structure that was made for shade, you could repurpose that for use as a Sukkah on the Yom Tov of Sukkot. But it was made for some other reason other than shade, then Allah you could not use it on Sukkot. We'll say next, Sukkah mikol makom la'asuyemai. When the Brisa said a Sukkah mikol makom, any kind of Sukkah, what does that come to include? La'asuye Sukkah, Sukkah's Ravkash, right? Or Rakbash, I should say, Rakbash. We'll say, what's a Rakbash? Listen to this. The Tan Rabbanon. Sukkah's Rakbash is Sukkah's Roim, the hut of shepherds. Right, the hut of shepherds, which I will say, Kishmo Kinu Rashi says, Sha'asa Sukkah Bisada Leishe Bisoacham Me'ashra B'Shom Litzonam. When the shepherd is watching his flock, he makes a little hut in order to provide some shade, right, protection from the sun and from the elements. Sukkah's Kayatzim, right? So we'll say Kayatzim. Interestingly enough, this is Kayatzim is the person who watches the figs. We'll say, in other words, they would dry figs. How do you dry figs? You spread them out on the ground and you watch them dry. So there's a guy whose job it is to watch the figs. We'll say, you ever have a day where you say, I really want to be the fig watchman, right? One of those days. That some days that looks like a dream job, right? I'm just going to sit in the field, work on my tan, right? And go build a hut, right? A little fridge in there and just watch the dates dry. It says the Gemara says Sukkah's Borginen. So Sukkah's Borginen is a hut. Rashi says Shomrei Ha'ir v'Kulin Yisraelim. So interestingly enough, what's the difference between the Rakbash and the Ganbach is that the Rakbash refers to huts owned by Jews. They were made by Jews, owned by Jews, right? So Jewish shepherds, or ultimately, again, Jewish fig watchers, or Borgin Rabbi say are like security tents, right? The people who would guard the city, guard tents. Sukkah's Borgin, Sukkah Shomrei Peros, or in general, again, someone else, let's say, guarding a field, right? Literally watching the fruit, guarding the field. So they would make these huts, Sukkah Mikol Makom, or any kind of Sukkah, Kshera. Ultimately, again, is going to be kosher. As long as, now we'll say, going back to what we said before, Misuchachas Kilchasa is going to mean what? Halacha Lamaisa, made for the sake of what? Shade. Good. So my Kilchasa, Bose says, by the way, what does that mean, Kilchasa? Amrav Chista, Vahu Sha'asa Litzel. It was made for shade. I was supposed to say, again, I don't need the sukkah made for the mitzvah of sukkah. What I need it made for is shade. Once it's made for shade, then I have the ability to transform it for use by not really doing all that much for sukkahs. So the Gemara says, Mikol makom la'asuye mai. When it says Mikol makom, any type of sukkah, what does that come to include? So the Gemara says, la'asuye sukkahs ganbach. That comes to include the sukkah of ganbach. So I will say, so now interestingly enough, we have two different brises over here, two different opinions. The first brisa indicates to us that you could go ahead and use a sukkah's ganbach. So remember the mnemonic, right? Ganbach, gimel goyim, nun nashim, beis. What was beis? Behema, thank you, and chaf kusim. Chaf kusim, right? You could use a sukkah any type of those four sukkahs. Second sukkah or second opinion said it's sukkah's rakbash. Roim, shepherds, kayatzim, the drying figs, burginin, security tents, shomrei peros, I should say, those watching the fruit. So we'll say, so again, it's either ganbach or rakbash. Now, interestingly enough, both are agreeing that what? Both are agreeing that halacha l'maisa, pretty much any type of structure can be used as long as what? It was made for the sake of providing shade. So we'll say, so now let's just analyze this. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. The Ganbach group started with the statement of Sukkah's Ganbach is kosher, and we can also come to include a Sukkah's Rakbash. The Rakbash group said, Rakbash Sukkahs are kosher, and we can also come to include Ganbach. So says the Gemara, let's analyze this just a little bit. So the Gemara says, Haitana de Ganbach. So we'll say the Tana of Ganbach, which was the first Tana, right? Goyim Noshim Behema Kusim. So Hai Tana Ganbach, Alima Le Ganbach. So we'll say he feels that the Ganbach sukkos are of greater, there's a stronger case to use Ganbach sukkos than there are to use Rakbash sukkos. Why is that? Listen to this. Mishum Dekavi. Because ultimately, you know, the common denominator amongst the Ganbach sukkos is that ultimately, again, they are kivi, they're established. They're established. They were of a more permanent nature. Now, obviously, they're all huts, but of a more permanent nature, as opposed to what? As opposed to v'katana mikamokom lasui rakbash delokavi. And therefore, we come to include the rakbash sukkos, because the rakbash sukkos ultimately, again, are a bit more of impermanent nature. So again, the first Tana will say the Ganbach sukkos make more sense because they're more kavua, but we'll also include the Rakbash sukkos that halacha l'maisa will also be kosher, even though they're a little bit less kavua. Look at Rashi, sukkos Rakbash, last Rashi in the daf. Delokavi, pamim roin kanu, pamim roin kan, kishach lesamira, v'chein kayotzim kisheyav shuholchin lahem v'soshin sukkasan. So we'll say just the nature. The Ganbach sukkos more often just remain in place. The Rakbash sukkos, like again, you even just start with the first gibel, roin, shepherd's hut. Where do you put the shepherd's hut? Where do you put the shepherd's hut? Wherever you need to. In other words, wherever there's pasture. And where there's pasture, there's not going to be pasture later on. So by definition, the first Tana holds, I like the Ganbach sukkos better, which I will say is interesting, right? Because the Ganbach sukkos, the common denominator is they belong to non-Jews. They belong to non-Jews, whereas the Rakbash sukkos all belong to Jews. But the first Tana will say, we don't really care about ownership, what we care about is nature of the structure. So Ganbach is a little bit better because they're a bit more permanent. This segues back to the previous sugi before, that to have some element of keva is actually advantageous. The second, but nevertheless, even the Tana of Ganbach will still hold that what? That Rav Kash or Rakbash is kosher as well. V'hai Tana de Rakbash, and the Tana who held that I like the Rakbash sukkahs better, he says, Alima le Rakbash de b'nei chiyuvaninhu. Ultimately, we'll say, why does the Tana of Rakbash like those? Because we'll say, who do the Rakbash sukkahs belong to? Jews. So you have a hut made for shade that was made and belongs to a Jew. So that Tana feels that's a little bit easier to repurpose such a hut like that to sukkah. Right? He likes the Jewish ownership piece more. So the Gemara says, the Tana mikomakom la'asuye ganbach. But again, even that, the Tana of Rakbash will agree that we also come to include the validity of ganbach sukkos, delav b'nei chiyuvaninu. Even though, again, the ganbach sukkos ultimately, again, belong to non-Jews, nevertheless, since they were structures made for shade, they will be kosher as well. So we'll say, an interesting machlokes, but at the end of the day, it turns out there's not really a machlokes. Because everyone is going to agree that at the end of the day, both types of sukkos are going to be kosher. Rakbash sukkos, which again are more permanent, but Gentile ownership. Rakbash sukkos, which are Jewish ownership, but a little bit more temporary. All of them are going to be kosher as long as what? As long as they were made for the purpose of providing shade. Now I will say we're going to see this sugya is going to make this sukkah is going to make much more sense when we get to tomorrow's Mishnah, because tomorrow's Mishnah is going to speak about a sukkah yeshana, which essentially is the case of taking an already existing structure and now utilizing it l'shem mitzvahs sukkah. And that's going to highlight the idea that a structure, a sukkah, need not be created l'shem mitzvah sukkah, that you could take a structure that already exists as long as it was made for shade and repurpose it for sukkah. What you have to do for it, Emirat Hashem, we'll see tomorrow a little bit. So we'll say, I'll just end off with one. The truth is, there's some interesting halachas also when it comes to the sukkah of the Yotzer. I'll just give you a Mara Makom in Siman Taf Reish Lamed Vav Sif Beis. The Shulchan Aruch actually talks. The Shulchan Aruch talks about all of these cases, and this is all halacha l'maisa. What I just will point out is as follows: that actually, no, I'll save this part for tomorrow. What I was supposed to end off with is as follows. I saw this once. I don't remember where I saw it. That there is a beautiful lesson that is contained in this ganbach and rakbash mnemonic. I will say, if you look at these words, leaving aside what they teach us by Sukkah, there's an incredible life lesson as well. Ganbach. So what does ganbach stand for? So again, the ganov bicha, it refers to the thief inside of you. So I will say, every person has a thief which resides inside of them. So what is my inner thief steal? My inner thief steals from me, right? My inner thief steals time by misusing it. My inner thief steals resources by misallocating it. My inner thief steals kochos by not maximizing them. That's the ganbach, the ganov bicha, using the middle base twice. The thief inside. So I'll say, how do you battle the inner thief? Because I'll say, isn't this the greatest challenge in life? The greatest challenge in life is that we steal from ourselves. We have so much potential. We have so much good. We have so many resources, emotional, spiritual, so many things that we could accomplish with. But yet we steal from ourselves and misappropriate from ourselves. So how do you go ahead and take care of the ganbach, the gan of bicha? So we'll say, what's the next mnemonic? Rakbash. We'll say, what does rakbash stand for? Rakbosh. Be embarrassed. Be embarrassed. Meaning what? That a person sometimes has to take a step back in life and take inventory and look at everything that Hashem has given me. Everything that Hashem has given me. All of the brachas, all of the beautiful things. And I'm both saying, remember, when you take stock, when you take inventory of your brachas, it does not minimize your challenges. The challenges are the challenges. But even with all of the challenges, take inventory of all of the brachas and ask yourself one simple question. Are you maximizing your brachas? And I will say the reality is that for most of us, when we ask that question, the answer usually is no. Rakbosh. Be embarrassed. Be embarrassed, but not the kind of embarrassment where you feel terrible about yourself, but the kind of embarrassment that motivates you to live differently and to just act differently. When I take a step back and I take inventory of all of my brachas, and then I realize, wow, I'm not maximizing those brachas. That's embarrassing. Because when someone gives you a bracha, right, it's if somebody went ahead and gave you $1 million, and you went ahead and you bought $1 million worth of lottery tickets, because you say, so this is such a great idea, because now I'm going to take the million and I'm going to make it, I don't know, what's the pot up to these days? So whatever it is, I'm going to make it into 65 million. We say, you're a fool. You're a fool. You could take the $1 million and invest it. You could take the $1 million and do this. But say, how many times in life does Kadosh Baruch Hu give us a whole world full of resources, a whole life full of resources? And instead, what am I doing? I'm showing up at 7-Eleven and just buying lottery tickets. I'm going ahead and totally misappropriating all the beautiful resources. Rak Bosh. Sometimes I have to be embarrassed about what I do with the resources that Kadosh Baruch Hu gives me. But the beautiful part is that the embarrassment is not an ends. The embarrassment is a means. Okay, I'm embarrassed about how I've used the resources until now, but I'm going to use that feeling of busha. I'm going to use that feeling of embarrassment to spur me to do better in the future. So it turns out that ganbach and rakbash are not just dinim in sukkah, but they're dinim in life. Ganav bicha analyzes sometimes I am the greatest thief. I don't steal from you. I don't steal from anyone else. I just steal from myself by misappropriating and misallocating the resource that Kadosh Baruch Hu has given me. And what's the answer? What's the antidote? Rakbash, rakbosh. Be embarrassed. And let the feeling of embarrassment not get you down, but let the feeling of embarrassment push you to do better going forward. So stop over here. Pick up a Mir Hashem with the new Succah tomorrow. Yes.